it's kind of trite to say, I believe the children are our future. They always have been and they always will be, obviously. But this past week provided another reason to be inspired by American youth. A quick thinking group of sixth graders in Mississippi saved their school bus drivers' lives and their own after the driver passed out at the wheel with her foot on the gas. Once the kids noticed the bus veering, they quickly delegated responsibilities. One student grabbed the steering wheel, another hit the brakes, a third student called 911, another called the school district, and a fifth gave the bus driver her medication. They'll be honored for their bravery at a school assembly. Wow. And that's amazing, but these stories don't always end with, and they all lived happily ever after. Many tragedies are not narrowly averted. Heroes are not always available. We can't just count on everyone acting perfectly in an emergency. And we can't just count on everyone always being all they can be. If everyone was at all times on their best behavior, we would have no crime and no war and no discrimination. But because we aren't always on our best behavior, we need to have guidelines for how people should be treated. Speed limits, visits to the donut shop by the health department, and other legal guardrails are part of the fabric of our civil society. To preserve order and common good, we count on our government to enact rules and to enforce regulations to protect us, a legislature to consider laws, a judicial system to interpret the laws, an executive group to enforce the laws. Of course, there are some principles that we don't need to enforce within a governmental system. You want to stay married? Communicate with sincere empathy. You want to be a good parent? Give your kids roots and wings. You want to have friends? Be respectful and kind and patient and listen. You want to be a citizen who chooses love your neighbor? Do it. No one stops you. You want to be a citizen who chooses not to love your neighbor? Or who chooses to love only some neighbors? Again, no one stops you unless you break the law. We have no laws that says that a donut shop owner has to like black people. But we do have laws that say that donut shop owners can't refuse to serve a patron because they don't like the color of that person's skin. So we're accustomed to the law protecting against official discrimination, either by the government or by an individual person engaging in commerce. The law can't tell you you have to be a good person, but it can punish you when you take some overt act demonstrating your bad faith. At least that's what we thought, until this week's U.S. Supreme Court decision, which, depending on your viewpoint, either clarified or gutted the Voting Rights Act. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution, enacted in 1870, outlawed racial discrimination in voting. But despite this being the supreme law of the land, black Americans continue to face barriers to one of our nation's most fundamental rights. For almost 100 years, activists marched, protested, and organized voter registration campaigns. For their advocacy, some were brutally beaten, others were murdered. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 required some state and local governments, mostly in the South, to get federal approval before changing their voting laws. It also prohibited election or voting practices that discriminate based on race, leading some states to redraw congressional maps with districts that have a majority of black voters. This week's Supreme Court decision made clear that the court is no longer interested in having the government play a role in fighting against racial prejudice. That fight is, according to our highest court, a private fight rather than a public one. You may recall Justice John Roberts declaring almost 20 years ago that, quote, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. He was then, as he continues now, ruling that race-conscious laws and affirmative actions have no place in our society. But notice that he wasn't saying the way to stop people from discrimination on the basis of race is to stop those people from discriminating on the basis of race. No, he just said that the way to stop governmental discrimination on the basis of race is to stop governments from discriminating on the basis of race. In essence, our Supreme Court now says governments used to discriminate against black people. They shouldn't have done that, but they no longer do that. So any laws or official practices that discriminate between groups, meaning giving a group an advantage, those are illegal laws or practices. 78 years ago today, a very different Supreme Court ruled in Shelley versus Kramer that covenants prohibiting the sale of real estate to blacks or members of other racial groups were legally unenforceable. That stopped official or overt or contractual discrimination. Yet it is still harder for a black person to buy or sell a house in some places than it is for others. So the Roberts Court says that although black people used to face official barriers, they apparently no longer do. So our governments no longer have to take down barriers to equality. In fact, under that reasoning, if a college wants to admit a black student, it means that a white student is being denied entry. The government will no longer make racial equity a priority. The government will be strictly colorblind. Ronald Reagan once said that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language were, quote, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Well, on this topic, the government says we're no longer going to help. And how is that going to work out? So here's one of the articles that I read about the decision. I'm just going to quote quickly from it. The Supreme Court limits the reach of the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court ruled today that Louisiana lawmakers had illegally used race as a consideration when drawing a majority black congressional district, as states have done for decades under the Voting Rights Act. All 6 of the court's conservatives agreed that Louisiana's majority minority district violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Justice Samuel Alito, who wrote for the majority, asserted that the court had kept intact the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was designed to guarantee the rights of minority voters. The 3 liberal justices dissented, arguing that the court had taken the final step to dismantle the Voting Rights Act. Justice Elena Kagan read her dissent from the bench, a rare move that often signals strong displeasure with the decision. I finished reading the article and I scanned on to the next article. The next article said, the justices also considered deportation protections. After announcing the Louisiana decision, the Supreme Court heard arguments over President Trump's push to end humanitarian protections that have allowed hundreds of thousands of Haitians and Syrians to live and work legally in the U.S. The justices appeared closely divided. Okay, so maybe we've made enough progress in America that color is no longer a barrier to voting. Maybe even in the Deep South, redistricting will be truly colorblind and won't reduce black representation. But color me skeptical. We'll see what happens with redistricting in areas of the country that historically enacted rules which marginalized the marginalized. Currently, the United States House of Representatives includes 67 black members, 62 Democrats, and 5 Republicans. None of the 5 Republicans are seeking re-election. The Supreme Court decision this week was based on the principle of a colorblind maiden liberty. Let's see how that number of 67 black representatives changes over the next few election cycles. This week in the New York Times, an article entitled, quote, "White drivers got a warning, Latino drivers got detained," documented how body camera footage reveals a disturbing pattern of state and federal officials using minor traffic stops to target black and brown drivers. But if racial discrimination is still a problem, just not one we can look to the government to solve, what's to be done? Well, if the laws won't help, then like so many other things, it's up to us as citizens. Part of our social contract calls on us to consider others, but that's not a legally enforceable contract. The golden rule isn't much of a rule. It doesn't force us to treat others as we would want them to treat us. Appeals to the better angels of our nature are only appeals, and yet together we rise. Groups like ours have to work even harder to try to change hearts and minds. If the government is getting out of the fight racism arena, then people like us need to stay in that arena even more. We can't just wait around and hope that there are kids on a school bus coming to our rescue. As we've done for almost 6 years, we need to continue to stand up and show up and speak up and to lean into the challenges of helping other people. Just as Southbury and other people across the country who share our values has a longer and harder road ahead of us, let that motivate us to continue and to run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Thank you.